The Monster Study was a developmental psychology study conducted by Dr. Wendell Johnson to learn about the development of a stutter as a speech impediment. It was coined the name the Monster Study because it threatened to ruin the reputation of psychologists behind it, and the ethical ideology was so scary to fellow psychologists that its results were later hidden for decades. The purpose of the study was to see if stuttering was a learned behavior or a result of biology. Dr. Wendell Johnson was an American psychologist, author, and proponent of general semantics. His fame in the field even led the Wendell Johnson Speech and Hearing Center to be named after him, which houses the University of Iowa's speech pathology and audiology programs. Despite being president and valedictorian of his high school class, he himself suffered from stuttering grotesquely. He studied speech pathology at a time when it was fighting to be considered a science, even being quoted to say, "I became a speech pathologist because I needed one." He believed speech research centered around a need for investigation of more highly differentiated ideas and their interrelationships in terms of spatial and temporal order. He emphasized the need for a thorough investigation study of the onset of stuttering. A study of the onset would need to include a detailed rational description of speech of very young children, specifically within 2 to 6 years of age, with reference to phenomena related to sound and word repetition. He even wrote, "Clinical significance of repetition varies with the environmental conditions under which it occurs," which led to the onset of the experiment. Prior to the study in the early 1930s, ethics and morality were not prioritized the way they are today in psychology and scientific experiments. And at this time, physiology explained the development of stuttering, originating from misdirected brain signals, an idea Johnson heavily contested. Johnson gathered fellow graduate students to study a different theory. All of the students stuttered almost as severely as him, and they used one another as guinea pigs in different tests. Some drew blood, struck knees to test reflexes, administered electroshock, or even shot off guns in the near distance to see if being startled affected speech. The gun experiment proved to impact normal speakers' speech, which proved a theory of Johnson's correct. Johnson's childhood laid the groundwork for his skepticism for the prior explanation for stuttering. He spoke fine until around the age of 5 to 6 when a teacher said he started to stutter and he grew obsessed as it progressed. He said that by worrying about the problem, he decided he produced it. His own life provided a case when the problem laid within his learned behavior. He needed to design an experiment that induced stuttering to prove his thesis off of proof rather than biography. He decided that if stuttering could be induced in normal speakers, it would prove it as a learned condition response. So Johnson decided to recruit one of his clinical psychology students to perform the experiment of talking students into a speech defect. He wanted to see whether telling non-stuttering students that they stuttered would make it occur. The study itself included 2 intents, the first being to induce stuttering within healthy children, and the second to see whether telling stuttering youth that their speech was fine would produce a change. The University of Iowa had an ongoing research relationship with the Soldiers and Sailors Orphans Home. The home was founded for refuge of offspring of killed soldiers during the Civil War, and in 1939 it housed more than 600 orphans in clusters of small cottages. After many trips to the orphanage to study the students, the study began with a selection of 22 subjects, 10 of which teachers marked as stutterers prior to the study, and 12 randomly selected fluent speakers from the population of orphan children. None of the subjects were aware of the research intent, which classified the experiment as a single-blind procedure. All of the subjects were then split into different groups of varying abilities and speech fluencies. 10 of the stuttering students were split into 2 groups, IA and IB. IA was the experimental set, and they were told, "You do not stutter, your speech is fine." Group IB was the control group and was told, "Yes, your speech is as bad as people say." The other 12 fluent speakers were divided into 2 groups, IIA and IIB. All of the subjects were of ages 5 to 15. Group IIA, which was the group that later led to a lawsuit and contention, was told speech was not normal at all, and that they were beginning to stutter and it must be corrected immediately. Group IIB were normal speakers and were treated as such, and even complimented on their enunciation. Mary started by studying each of the child's IQ. Her and 5 other graduate students served as judges, scaling all 22 children on their speech from 1 to 5, 1 being poor and 5 being fluent. She also studied their handedness to test the correlation between that and speech. She also talked to each student for about 45 minutes a week. To the stuttering children, she gave positive affirmations, using quotes like, "You'll get better," "You'll outgrow your stutter," "Pay no attention to other people's words." But to the healthy children, she used quotes such as, "You're starting to stutter," "Your symptoms of speech concur with other stutterers," and "These speech defects need to be fixed immediately." Tudor experienced the immediate impact in each case of non-stuttering children of Group IIA of subjects beginning to act like stutterers and showing overt behavioral changes, including inhibitive, sensitive, and embarrassed reactions, and subjects becoming less talkative. She found that it was immediately difficult to get kids to speak who spoke fluently a month prior. The subjects practically refused any communication with Mary or with their peers. Some examples of emotional distress impacts included Hazel Potter, a 15-year-old girl who started to talk much less and became much more self-conscious, even beginning to interject and snap her fingers in frustration during the study, saying things like, "I'm afraid I was going to say it." All of the children's schoolwork fell off, and they became afraid to recite in class. Most became withdrawn and refused to speak to their friends, and even Corlask, a 12-year-old girl, ran away from the orphanage after 2 years of the study in fear of further emotional distress. After the study was completed, Tudor returned back to the orphanage 3 times to provide follow-up care, and she said she understood that the experiment left a lasting impression on the subjects' minds, yet believed that they would recover with time. The most telling aspect of the study today is that it's considered a failure. Both results were insignificant and predicted change in the wrong direction. The concluded results included shuffling of feet, whispering, snapping, and induced tics, which are all behavioral features of stutterers, while the subjects still ended up speaking fluently. Of the 6 fluent speakers who were falsely labeled as stutterers, 2 improved their speech fluency, 2 didn't experience a change, and 2 experienced a decrease in fluency. And of the stutterers who were told they spoke fine, 2 had slight improvements of fluency, 2 decreased, and 1 was unchanged. As the study was planned with good intentions in hopes of finding a cure or reversal for the development of a speech impediment, after many trials on their own selves and peers, Johnson and his graduate students crossed the line in testing on orphans, minors without their consent. Not only the minors, but the staff of the orphanage were also unaware of the study's parameters behind the scenes, which left the children vulnerable to the study's lasting psychological effects. But what Johnson and Tudor were unaware of in 1939 was that the morning of this study sparked a later multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the state of Iowa and the University of Iowa after major controversy of ethics. After Tudor submitted her thesis in August of 1939, it sank straight into obscurity, not receiving national press attention until 2001 in a series of articles in the San Jose Mercury News. After publication of the study, professors argued the ethics of the experiment, some acknowledging the importance of the data and others arguing it didn't come to any real conclusions, and also crossed ethical boundaries. Franklin Silverman, a speech pathology professor, said it was coined the name the monster study because it reminded people of the Nazi experiments on human subjects, as Nazi Germany was known for conducting studies on marginalized groups in the name of science. Other professors also knew the data, if published, would ruin Johnson's reputation and verity. The irony behind the experiment is that Johnson, of all people, sanctioned the experiment, knowing the trauma and pain of a stutter being noticed and exaggerated. 30 years after Johnson's passing, the University of Iowa issued a formal apology for the study, making the national news in which subjects unveiled the truth of the study. In the early 2000s, some subjects started to seek justice. 3 individuals within the group IIA, or the so-called stutterers, sued the university for emotional distress and fraudulent misrepresentation. The lawsuit also included the estates of 3 other group IIA members. Testimonies given during the trial included the loss of confidence and friendship within the orphanage due to inherent silence after distress, and permanent or modern-day struggles in public speaking or social functions. The subjects within Group IIA ended up winning their settlement, and the University of Iowa paid over $1 million to the victims and their estates. Despite the somewhat recent controversy and the lawsuit behind the monster study, it is important and telling of origins of speech defects, ethics of science, brittleness of youth minds, and the egos of driven individuals. As the findings of the study were exposed, there has been an inherent caution of not repeating a similar study, and the experiment became known as an important lesson in transparency and consent and experimentation within not only the field of psychology, but many other fields, evolving them into fields of ethical science.